This is the Startupsdilse podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Do us a favor, subscribe on YouTube or LinkedIn, and be sure to give us your feedback. Hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another brand new episode of startupsdilse. We're joining you here after a few weeks break, and I'm delighted to bring to you this episode because this is a pretty special and unique episode because we've not had someone who's coming from this particular background as our guest on this call. So I'm excited for all of you to know our guest here, Jason Zimmerman, is joining us. And I got to know Jason a few weeks ago through a mutual friend, and I've been super impressed at what Jason's been up to. Don't worry about it, Jason. Dogs are welcome. So Jason and his doggies on our podcast today. And Jason, why don't you kick us off by telling us I should say, I know Jason as a few things. In my 2-3 weeks of knowing him, Jason's an economist. That's what he studied when he did his bachelor's program. He's a strategist. He's focused on a lot of strategy. And I must also say, given his new adventure, Jason will also call himself a founder, right? So he is going to tell us about Threefold Collective. I know 3 things about Jason already. So how about that for a start, Jason? So give us a little bit about a background and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on first off. So thank you. And the time that I got to know you, I've told you this before. I love your style. It's organic. Use your quick wit and intelligence to sort of prompt up the right questions. And so this is a real treat for me. And so I genuinely appreciate you having me on as a guest, as well as my dog, who will 100% make an appearance at some point. So so as you said, I founded Threefold Collective, which is a brand new consulting organization that leverages my background in 3 specific areas. As you mentioned, economics, where I actually studied behavioral economics and applied that to certain areas. And so there's the research component and the research element that a lot of my work is grounded in. But at the same time, I used that and I pushed it into sort of an applied understanding of strategy. And so I moved into consulting. And from there, what we were looking at, leveraging a lot of the sort of psychological elements of the economics background and applied it into organizational sociology. And from there, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but I applied that directly inside of an organization, a Fortune 500 firm, where I got to experiment with those ideas and really inform all the way back into how strategy, how research can approach a problem in a unique way, in a very holistic way. And so I used that to found Threefold Collective. And so far we've had some early successes, and I'm excited to share the journey with you.
Perfect. So let's, I think, roll back a few years, right? I've always, maybe it's just me, economics was always a boring subject, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Not a lot of people will say, you know what, I want to do economics,
Yeah.
And in your case, behavioral economics, I'm like, my goodness, I would never pick that. So what made you even pick that as something that you wanted to start your college journey with? And then, of course, based off of that, you're going to build your career as well. Was there a pull of any sorts that kind of drew you to that, Jason?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is a pull behind there. So if we go back to me as a child, right? I was growing up with my mother, and she was a very creative type, and she, for whatever reason, could not figure out how to balance a checkbook. Finances always became a little bit of a struggle for her. And for me, I looked at that as a young child, and it only took me, years later to actually articulate what that was. But it was simple math. It was simple addition and subtraction. And for whatever reason, she couldn't put those 2 things together. It took me some time to realize that after injecting the sort of psychological component of that, when you start to think about how money plays a role in society, and you start to think about sort of the representation that money can have in terms of status and even the reflection of who you are, this very simple math injected with psychology became this almost non-Euclidean geometry for her. It became so complex that she couldn't necessarily interact and engage with it. And so for me, money, I think, became a really fascinating topic very early on, which is economics, or at least it can be. Market traits and those sort of things can really be part of what economics is founded on. It's trade, it's bartering back and forth, right?
Yeah.
When I got out of school, 20 years ago now, behavioral economics coming out of University of Chicago and Richard Thaler's work was just coming to the forefront. And so when I came across that, it became sort of the voice, the articulation that I was always looking for to sort of understand at a very micro level at this point what it was that was blocking my mother and at this point a lot of people that I saw around me when it came to money and sort of its role, not just in society, but in terms of who we are as individuals.
Beautiful. I mean, I always love the backstory to these things. I mean,
Yeah,
more often than not, it starts somewhere in our childhood, right?
right.
And I mean, I've had 20 episodes so far. I mean, you're not the first person who said it started with my mother, but I always love those stories where, I saw my mother doing this. It
Yeah,
was so great that she did it, or, that
right.
triggered me to do something like that. I mean, we all thank our mothers for what we are right now, and I guess in your case it's no different, right? So
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
yeah, so very cool. So you did your economics. I mean, I believe that's
yep.
in the Indiana University or
Yeah, I
University
went
of
to Indiana
Indiana.
University to study
Yeah.
economics. I walked away with degrees in finance and accounting as well. So you can see the quantitative underpinnings of sort of where I began.
Yeah. So, and then I'm trying to build up to what you're trying to do now. So you
Yeah.
went on to do your MBA as well. I mean, I'm assuming Kellogg's was a great experience.
Yeah, Northwestern Kellogg, it was a great experience. So there is a little bit of story in between there. So coming out of undergrad, I had intentions of going to get my PhD in economics and really
Wow.
pursue the theoretical component. I always, even as a kid, I just really loved thinking about a problem. And that was my intention. But at some point when I was applying to PhD programs, someone told me they're like, you might have a better experience if you get a little bit of real world experience underneath your belt. That would help
Hmm.
you understand not just economics in the theory, but it would help you understand the economics in the applied sense. And so that's where I found myself at a small research consulting firm where I got very fortunate to get connected in with a researcher at the time who was looking into the shift of our government clients from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. And what his
Yeah.
major thesis was is that defined benefit plans being driven by professional money managers and that shift into defined contribution plans run by individuals like my mother, for instance, had significantly lower outcomes. And what
Yeah.
we were trying to use or think about was how to apply economic incentives mixed in with psychology to drive better outcomes. And so, that intervening period between getting my master's, where I really focused on organizational sociology in my MBA, started out by looking at the individual and its role. And that sort of propelled me into consulting, where I worked at Mercer on the mergers and acquisitions team, looking at both pre and post acquisitions. And if you think about that thread that kind of weaves through there, that thread relies on the individual. If you take two organizations coming together,
Yeah.
right, the success of that organization is going to be based off of whether those people can connect, right? People are the
Yeah.
greatest asset of any firm, and
Yeah.
tapping into that is what we were
The
trying to do. So
compatibility, basically. Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
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 And so that's that thread of sort of how behavioral economics can be extended, not from the individual, but more into a macro view, like an organization and a sociologist. So,
Fascinating, Jason. I mean,
yeah,
I will admit I have absolutely no idea into this field, but every
yeah.
time I speak to you, I learn a lot,
Oh, I
And I mean,
appreciate it.
of course understand the whole change management aspect of it, which comes
Yeah.
along with it. But I mean, that's just a minuscule aspect of what goes into this, right?
Yeah.
To even see, to your point, is there a good fit if it's an M&A?
Yeah.
If
That's right.
it's just an A part of the M&A, is that even a good fit for them to come in? Because at the end of the day, it's not about what you acquire or merge with. I mean, it's about whether those people can work together, right?
Yeah. No, this is what I said at the start of this. Like your raw intelligence and curiosity allow you to pick up on an idea and articulate it in a beautiful way. And that's what you just did. It really is. I like to think of it sort of like any organization coming together or any change event coming together is how do you make it greater than some of its parts? One of the things you
Yeah.
will hear me say over and over again is I care about one equation, and that's making 1 + 1 = 3. And that is, of any change, of any evolution, whether it's us as individuals or an organization, that change allows us to get to a better place. But there is, I believe, a fundamental underlying conceit within that change is hard, right?
Yeah.
We don't know necessarily what we're getting into, or maybe there's certain hurdles or barriers or certain friction points that we have to get through. And that is a purely psychological problem. And I
Yeah.
do believe, especially in the arena that I work in, you think about it from an organizational standpoint, and now you're starting to talk about how individuals interact with each other. And so the sociological component of how that
Yeah.
operates gets in.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously economics, you're working within a capitalistic society, and at the end of the day, we are trying to make money for our organization. And so it really is this interdisciplinary approach to what I like to say is just to accelerate that change, to make that
Yeah.
change less frustrating, to make that change, less full of friction, to allow people to sort of regain clarity and control as they move into that new change. And by doing that, I think you can, benefit both the employees of an organization, you can benefit yourself as an individual, but you can also benefit the goals of the organization.
Got it. So let's move on in a little bit in your journey, right? So
Yeah.
you did your MBA. You told me about the real world experience. I think whoever gave you that advice was very wise. I mean,
Right.
I wish everybody does that, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean,
Agreed.
especially before doing an MBA, I think the real world experience really helps you connect to a lot of the things that they teach you in the MBA. I found that out myself. That's why I can speak to that.
Yep.
And then you mentioned earlier, Jason, you were in a Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company for a while. You did a bunch of roles there, a lot of that to do with economics. You also did a lot of strategy, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, what the company should be doing or the different departments. How did that experience, tell us a little bit about that experience and how that has helped you to get to where you are
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah. The one thing that made me think about sort of the shape this part of the story is there's research out there by John Cotter coming out of Harvard. And a lot of people listening to this may know this work, but it's John Cotter's seminal work that says 70% of strategies fail. And when you look at the 8 reasons that he came up with, they fail at implementation, summarized by me as employee resistance, by certain psychological factors that individuals, that companies struggle with when it comes to execution. And so for me, because theory was always my end game, because I just wanted to develop sort of the next horizon of thinking, especially within behavioral economics, I shifted into strategy, thinking that was the next level down. And while I was there, I brought this quote, this research to one of my global directors. And I said, how do we know that our strategy isn't part of that 70%? And paraphrasing a very long conversation, I was basically told, why do we care? We've already been paid. And that propelled me to understand and think about that at a deeper level. If I could understand how execution works, then I could make better strategy, which that better strategy would then go into a better theory. And so having spent, 6-7 years in this research and theoretical and strategic place, I had an opportunity to move in with this financial services firm, and they allowed me to really begin to think about how to execute these things. I worked inside the executive office for most of my time there. And what I was doing is taking the strategy that executive office was coming up with and connecting it back into the organization. And so I was directly closing that gap that John Cotter identified, that 70% gap. And so I spent 13 years inside the organization doing this, and I think had a lot of success doing it. There are some failures there, which of course we all learn from our failures, but by continuing to learn and evolve from that, I ended up getting to a place, given my research background, where I would actually be much closer to not a 70% failure rate, but much closer to a 30 or 40% failure rate. So I would really be successful maybe 60 to 70% of the time. And that is not exactly reassuring, but when you think about the complexity of a 15,000 person organization and moving a firm through that change, a 30 to 40% failure rate is astronomical. It's really a very
Huge.
impressive number that, I think I attribute a lot to sort of my experimentation and learning back in theory and research, but also just obviously the people surrounded with me and, the organization itself to really allow that experimentation to take shape.
Yeah. So I'm glad you said successes and failures, because that was going to be my next question.
Sure.
And I'm going to make it a two-part question, right? So obviously, I mean, like anything else, you have some wins and losses. You might come up with a certain strategy. You said, that's 70%. I mean, the 30%, all that good stuff. And to your point, if you can't make that 1 + 1 = 3, I mean, at least in your words, I mean, it's a failure.
Yep.
So you also mentioned research. I mean, and I believe that's a big part of the success as well.
Yep.
I've known cases where people just go by gut feel versus research, which is such a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, have you done any sort of correlation, Jason, to see, oh, my research was wrong, or I studied the wrong inputs in this case, or the wrong parameters? Have you seen any sort of correlation between research and actual success of whatever program you went through or initiative you went through?
I mean, it's always a complex answer, right? The answer is yes and no. So as a researcher, I want to have this in a lab where I can control all the variables and say this is exactly what's pointing to it. And unfortunately, that research, not only through myself or even in the industry right now, is still very nascent. It's still growing, and it's just not there. I am engaged with a few consulting firms that I hope to announce pretty soon, where we are actually going to try to run those controlled experiments in a much greater way and hopefully produce some white papers so that we can identify those. So from the traditional research background, that's not there yet. But from a practiced researcher who understands correlation, causation, and the scientific method, I've done my best to really try to isolate a single variable and make that change. And by understanding that one variable within a larger system, I can start to get a more intuitive or experienced or even anecdotal evidence that says, yeah, this is what is driving that. And so I do have a bunch of that that I was able to explore with and sort of understand at a deeper level. And a lot of those cases, including the early success of Threefold Collective, is on our website for people to explore. And so a lot of that comes down to just looking at sort of communication patterns and how individuals communicate and how silos may be formed and what interjections you can play in order to drive that communication forward, in order to close that communication silo, right? At the same time, some of the greater success that we've had is thinking about and learning about the adoption curve and what it is that allows people to embrace change as opposed to reject change or to resist change. A lot of those things come down to more the psychological factors that are heavily researched and we can point back to in terms of just loss of clarity, loss of control, and just the general nature of influence that we can tap into. And so there are some interesting tools and techniques that allow us to measure and quantify how an organization might look. And by doing that, we're able to retest those measures and see how these interventions can sort of drive a certain outcome that we're looking to have. So yeah, we've definitely approached this as scientifically as we can, but
I love
we're
that
hoping to go a little
aspect.
deeper.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, again, frameworks. I love frameworks because
yeah,
at least they put some discipline in your thought process. I mean, some of them work, some of them don't work, but at least there's some sort of organization to it.
yeah,
And to your point, I mean,
yeah,
based on what you said, I mean, that is the way to go, right? I mean, and even with threefold, maybe that's a good segue for us to get in there. Research,
yeah.
strategize, and execution of that,
That's
right,
right.
is super important.
Yeah.
So why don't we jump into your pet project then, Jason? What made you move on from what seems to be like a pretty exciting role at the Fortune 500 company to
Yeah.
do your own thing? I mean, what was the trigger?
Yeah. So, Threefold Collective, exactly as you said, it's a holistic strategy consulting firm in which we focus on organizational transformation. We focus on bringing a company from point A to point B. And our skill set, I think our trait, is really focused on some of the tools within sociological research, things like social network analysis that will allow us to quantify an organization and sort of their fingerprint, if you will, the informal network behind the formal network in order to accelerate change. And as I mentioned earlier, by accelerating change, there are certain benefits that both the employee and the organization will reap from accelerating through that change. So in my time at this Fortune 500 firm, I was fortunate enough to stand up 3 different organizations to guide this organization to set up these divisions and drive that change from the ground up. So there was one failure, as I mentioned, that we stood it up and it survived for about 12 to 18 months, but it actually came out just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it didn't have enough time to really take root. But we did learn from those things. And so the next 2 iterations of this, we were able to get better, smarter, be more thoughtful about how we went through that. And by applying those lessons on this 3rd launch, we were actually working with one of the big bulge bracket consulting firms, and they told us that by going through this change, which affected 15,000 people across the organization, it would take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, which
Mm,
anybody who's worked with a consulting firm knows they're going to be more on the optimistic side of those timelines. But having worked in those firms myself, I said, hey, listen, we need your expertise, that knowledge sharing of what other organizations have done and sort of the friction points that they've come up with is important. We also sort of need the traditional change management techniques that these firms are really known for. But let's interject this social network analysis. Let's interject the psychology of the organization, the sociology of the organization, to identify where those friction points are and really who are the influencers in that organization to accelerate it. And so if you take even just the more optimistic timeline, 5 years, we were able to drive this change in 2.5 years. And so
wow.
that is doubling of the adoption rate by using the traditional change management methods, but just complementing it with these concepts from sociology, social network analysis, to identify influencers, to leverage those influencers, and to really propel the organization, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, to use the
Yeah.
people, to use the core asset of any organization to propel it forward. And so by having this success, to answer your question directly, I thought, well, what's my next move? And I've always gone back to, the organization. They've always been very favorable and saying, cool, here's sort of the next thing that we want you to do. But I thought, why not do this on my own? Why
Yeah.
not go out
Help more people.
and yeah, exactly. I enjoy the theory. I enjoy the strategy. I enjoy the application of it. But there's a selfish component of it of, why not reap the benefits myself? But at the same time, why not be able to really focus on what I love and what I think is that real driver of success? So as we said, what are sort of the techniques that I've learned over, the past 20 years? And that really is social network analysis. And our approach to that data collection and to processing and interpreting that information is something that we at Threefold find to be our value, our skill, our proprietary sort of proposition to the world. And so yeah, wanted to take that out and see if we could apply that at a much greater scale. And so that's the journey we're
Awesome.
on.
Yeah, so wish you all the best, first of all.
Thank
And
you.
I've heard this from many a founder, right? I mean, early days, they say, man, it's very lonely out here.
Yes,
It's a scary world.
it
So
is.
how has the early days of Threefold been? I mean, and do you feel validated that, hey, Jason, this is the right move for me to do? And I mean, in other words, I
Yeah,
mean, where are you in your journey as a founder,
yeah.
as Threefold, and what's coming up with Threefold?
I'll say this. I think both can be true. I do feel validated in sort of the early days, not just with the results that we have been able to accomplish for our clients, but just the feedback that I am capturing from different folks, including yourself when you and I first met. And there is some white space in the market for this. John Cotter's research, for instance, came out 45 years ago. And if you look at some of the research coming out by McKinsey and PwC, we are still at 70% failure rates. And so nearly half a century later, we're not getting any better at implementation. And
Yeah.
obviously that has to do with a lot of complexity in our current, environment, our current ecosystem, and all those other factors that sort of drive that. But the idea is there is a way to get better at that. And by having some of these early results that I've been able to replicate at least, 4 times now, and be able to share that with clients and say, here is something that is developing and I think brand new that can really accelerate your ROI. Yeah, we've had a lot of really good success. But at the same time, it is a lonely space. And I wish I knew more about that feeling coming into it, because it can be frustrating at times, which I know a lot of your guests have shared as well. And in a lot of our cases, we're developing a new market, and we're developing something that people haven't necessarily seen or heard about. And again, we can apply the same notion that I work in, is change is hard. And so adoption of something new is going to be hard. And so there is a lot of work that I think any founder has to do in order to establish that market and to really build a following. And that is, as you know better than any of us, that is partly the results, the quantitative, the things that you can point to, but it's also partly the qualitative, who you are as that founder and the people you surround yourself with, but also the people that you connect with, the clients, and what their challenges are, and how you can connect with them. And it really is you got to form that deep interconnected relationship for all of those elements. And at least for me, never having done that, I'll say this, I'm glad I have an experimental scientific mind. And there have definitely been some failures along the way, but I am learning from those failures and getting more successful. And like I said, I think we're getting a lot of success with our clients as well. And really developing this and moving in the right direction.
Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, obviously, there's no reward without risk, right?
That's
I
right.
mean, you and a lot of us regret saying, "Oh man, if only I had done that." Right?
Yeah.
That's always the thing with the founders, right? Or people
Yeah.
who never became founders, including, I mean, myself. Even this podcast. I mean, I've been thinking about it for a long time,
Yeah.
and I was like, man, I mean, if I don't start, I would not ever do it. So I just
Yeah.
started, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad I did. So I mean, I can echo that feeling.
Yeah.
One of the things I picked on what you said is you said social network analysis,
Yes.
Jason, right? And in the world we live in today, I mean, especially in the US, I mean, it is so complex.
Yeah.
You have people from so many different cultures. I mean, so many. That's who we are as a country as well. I mean,
Yeah.
and in today's world, I mean, add the even more complex factor of people of all ages and different dynamics coming
Yeah.
together. I mean, have you seen from through your lens? I mean, that's a big part of what you need to
Yeah.
analyze. I mean, what are the things that have struck you as like, an aha moment. I mean, just in terms of, how that impacts a yes or no decision as part of the strategy,
Yeah.
or, to say, you know what? I mean, this is great because of
Yeah.
that. I mean, I'm just trying to understand how that factor has evolved over the last 2 decades that you've been doing this.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because social network analysis is one of the tools that I will say is the game changer in the industry right now. And social network analysis has been around for a long time. It's an easy concept to understand, right? We're all on social networks, for instance. We're all on, Twitter, I guess X now. We're all on LinkedIn, and that is our social network. And there is a term out there that we also use as sociologists called influencers. And
Mm,
what influencers are, if you get into the nerdiness of the math that I really enjoy, is called eigenvector centrality. And eigenvector centrality is status, is influence. And so if you can identify who has status or who has influence based on that social network, because influence will change and evolve based on the environment that you're in. And so it's critical to understand the psychology of how influence begins. But once you can look at and quantify mathematically that eigenvector centrality, that status, you can start to identify who holds that power in an organization. And when you start to translate it in that way, that's what I think really connects in with people
yeah,
qualitatively. If we all assess our own networks, we know the people that are well connected within there. And so if we want to get something done, if we want to connect in with somebody at a different organization that we may not know, say we're looking for a new job and we know somebody that works at that organization, we will qualitatively ask our friends if they know somebody there. What a quantitative approach allows is it really allows for not just the scale of that at a much larger sort of footprint, but it also allows us to be really precise.
mm,
And so social network analysis in this way, eigenvector centrality and all the math that sort of goes behind it is a descriptive statistic. And that just allows us to describe how the world looks today. But by
yeah,
understanding that, it allows us to intervene. And so if we get back to sort of the original question and what that context leads up to, is if you know who holds the power in your organization, then you
mm,
can leverage their skill set for several different things. If you're going through a change, you can invite that person into the conference room and say, hey, here's the approach that we want to go with. How would you think this might look or operate within your environment? Is there anything we need to do to change that?
yeah,
Assuming that they may buy into that, and maybe they want to become a person that becomes a champion of that. Then they can
yeah,
go back and they can help to spread that word to say, hey, I've experimented with this and this is a great tool, for instance, that we're using. I think we should all adopt it. And if you're a person hearing that from somebody that you consider influential, right? Because influence is always dependent on you, the person receiving that. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if you can tap into that and you can influence people, you can scale that learning curve much more quickly. And so if you think about it from a perspective, we've all been involved in change in some way, shape, or form. And maybe it's the CEO of your company and you've never sat down with that CEO. They certainly have authority and that's a certain type of influence. But if you can hear that same message from the colleague that you've worked with for the past 15 years, and they
yeah,
have embraced that change, and that's somebody
yeah,
that you trust and has your best interests at heart, then you're going to be a little bit more open to accepting what that might look like. And it's that
yeah,
nature of the psychology mixed in with the mathematics of sociology applied to change that allows us to really begin to accelerate that. And so it's influence is sort of the name of the game, and that's exactly where social network analysis allows us to identify, or at least that is the primary application that we're experimenting with at this point.
fascinating again, Jason. I
Yeah,
mean, there's so many layers to this, right? And
there are.
uh, as humans, we think we understand all this, but not to the level that you just explained. So I'm glad somebody like you is looking into all these things, checking all those boxes and making
Yeah.
sure the math adds up before those big decisions where a lot of lives are impacted. I mean, literally,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So cool that you're doing that. So I want to pivot to something on the research side, and this is something that everybody talks about these days. So might want to get your perspective on that too. So obviously, a lot of research is data driven, right?
Yep.
And in today's world, everybody wants to use AI for a lot of these things, right?
Yeah.
So what's your, in the three fold approach to what you do, a threefold, right?
Yeah.
Um, where do you see AI kind of helping you? I'm assuming there is a play,
Yeah.
especially on the research and data analysis aspect of it. Have you given it any thought, Jason?
Yeah. So especially from running the calculations, and I think when you take any large data set, there, in order to just run those calculations much more quickly and look at that from various different perspectives and different angles, to us, that just gives us more opportunity to see something that maybe we haven't seen. And so we have worked with AI in order to apply that. And there are some applications that will allow us to accelerate that math. And I think that's great because that gives us more perspective, but it also cuts down the time in order to
Yeah.
start interpreting it. There are some challenges, I think, right now with the data collection side of it. And so right now, intuitively, as I mentioned, influence is, within the holder, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so influence is defined by the person that you're talking to. And so
Yeah.
right now, collecting that data is still a very human-based effort. But there are, like Microsoft Copilot is out there, and they will do a certain level of social network analysis that a lot of us maybe are familiar with, right? And so in Microsoft Copilot within Teams, they have this clout calculation, and that clout calculation is driven by AI. And what it does is it looks across the ecosystem and it says, who is this person emailing with? Who is this person sitting in the conference room with? Who is this person calling? And there are limitations within that we should be aware of. Is even though you and I may sit in a conference room together, it may not identify the nature of the relationship that you and I have. We have all been in a conference room where somebody has derailed a conversation, for instance. And so Microsoft Copilot, or AI as it looks today, may look at that and sort of say, oh, well, they're in the same room, so they have influence, they have connection to each other. But if you actually try to tap into that influence of that person who's derailed it, they may not get you to where you want to be. And so it's still, I think, imperative at this point in terms of AI to do the data collection in the traditional sense, but we can process it through AI and run those calculations much more efficiently than we've been able to in the past.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, whatever AI model you might have, their output is as good as the data input. And in your, to your answer, if you don't have that initial good data for the model to take in, what you're going to get is, as good as not using it. Right.
That's right.
So
That's right.
That makes total sense. I'm assuming, much like with everything else, this will evolve as well, and you can get a lot more out of it. But I would say we're still in such early stages of what is possible and not. So I'll be fascinated to see how you apply to threefold as well.
Yeah, me too.
Jason,
I'll be interested to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, perfect. So thanks so much, Jason. As always, with any conversation with you, I learned a ton.
Thank you.
Looks like threefold is something that a lot of companies, not just trying to do M&A, but even with strategy, and especially in the ever-changing world that we live in, could use. So I wish you and the team the very best, and would love to have you on sometime in the future to tell us how you're doing, both as a founder as well as everything that you love to do. So on behalf of our podcast, all the best to you, Jason.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And like I said, every conversation with you, I think I learned something as well. So I appreciate everything
Thanks.
you're doing and just the platform you're creating, not just for myself, but for other founders. So in the same way, keep up the good work that you're doing and just know we appreciate you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
All right. Thank you.